in the cockpit. Believe me, I was certain it was Andreas. He wasn't a coward. He knew something about planes, and he had the capacity to do something.
In fact, Prodromou had his commercial pilot's license. It was the first step towards his goal of becoming a captain for Helios.
It's the sort of day I'd like to be out flying.
Oh, you will, Andreas.
But all of his training wouldn't have helped save the jet. When he was seen at the controls, Flight 522 had been in the air for almost 3 hours. And the reason the Helios plane seemed to veer away from the F-16s following it was because its left engine was out of fuel. No matter what caused the alarms to sound, the ultimate reason for the crash was simple.
The DFDR and CVR gave us absolute proof that the plane ran out of fuel. And this was the cause of the crash.
Soulakis now knows who was in the cockpit of the plane and why it crashed. But to fully understand the mystery, he needs more information.
Mayday.
His investigators uncover a suspicious history of maintenance issues with the Helios jet, issues that could help explain what happened on Flight 522. Less than a year before the crash, the same aircraft had suffered a rapid decompression. Lazaros Timetsian worked on that flight.
I was in the back of the aircraft at the time. There was a loud metallic bang, a clanging sound, and the oxygen masks dropped in the cabin. Every step I was taking was difficult. It was hard to move, hard to breathe. In fact, I was starting to pant. I was panting for air.
As the plane began an immediate descent to 3,300 meters, all Timetsian could do was remain strapped in and wait. Once the plane reached a safe altitude, Timetsian inspected the rear door and was shocked by what he found.
I noticed that the aft service door was not fully locked. The hinges on the top and the bottom of the door were kind of displaced. I could pass my hand right through.
There were no injuries, and the plane made an emergency landing, and the door was inspected. There were more recent problems as well. A Helios ground engineer tells Soulakis that on the very day of Flight 522, the 737 had another problem with its back door.
When we checked the flight log for the trip, we saw that we'd have to do some unscheduled maintenance.
The plane had arrived in Cyprus just after midnight on August the 14th. The cabin crew had heard loud banging noises and saw ice on the rear service door during the flight. It was scheduled to take off again just hours later. Soon after it landed, engineers began checking the problem. To make sure there's nothing wrong with the seal on the door, the engineers run a pressurization test. During normal flight, a plane's engines force air into the cabin. To ensure oxygen circulates during the trip, small valves in the rear allow some of it to leak out.
A pressurized airplane essentially is sort of like a pressurized can. Well, we pressurize the airplane so that the people inside can survive the environment that the airplane likes to operate in.
Switching digital pressure control unit from auto to manual.
Without the jet's engines running, the engineer uses the plane's auxiliary power unit to force air into the aircraft, and the cabin is pressurized for several minutes.
It's like looking for a leak in a tire. In this case, what you're having to do is pressurize the aircraft, use a barometer essentially to monitor the pressure inside, and look for leaks that way.
But there's no indication any air is escaping through the back door.
In this case, they felt that it was all right, and they completed the test.
The entire jet seems to be in good working order. After performing a series of additional routine maintenance procedures, the engineers signed off on their technical log. Investigators are faced with a dead end.
Explain again how you tested the pressure.
An explosive decompression could have explained the tragic events of Flight 522. If the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the jet, everyone on board could have been overcome. But not only did engineers check the problem, when the F-16s approached the plane near Athens, no damage was seen. There was no indication that the fuselage was punctured. Investigators are still struggling to solve the mystery. What had overcome the passengers and crew of Helios Flight 522? And why was one flight attendant apparently unaffected? The discovery of one small switch holds the key to the entire crash. The crash of Helios Flight 522 is one of the most mysterious air disasters ever.
Helios 522, do you read? Over?
All investigators know for sure is that shortly after takeoff, the crew stopped communicating with air traffic controllers.
Helios 522, over.
They still don't know what had happened to the plane's captain or the rest of the crew.
Tell me about what happened the day of the flight.
They concentrate on the conversation between the pilot and the Helios engineer shortly after takeoff. As the plane passed through 3,700 meters, an alarm sounded in the cockpit.
Operations, this is Flight 522, over.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
We have a takeoff config warning on.
Pardon?
Our takeoff config warning is on.
Usually, the takeoff config warning is only triggered on the runway. But wreckage recovered at the crash site reveals no problems with the plane's flaps, landing gear, or anything else that could trigger the alarm. So why had it sounded? Chief Investigator Akrivos Tsolakis focuses on a small control panel found in the wreckage of the ravaged jet.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
We were lucky. Finding this panel, which had the switch on the manual position, was a major one.
The P5 pressurization panel ensures that passengers have enough air to breathe, even at high altitudes. Normally, pressurization takes place automatically. As the jet climbs, its engines force air into the plane as they power it through the sky. But when the pressurization switch is set to manual, both the captain and co-pilot are responsible for maintaining the cabin atmosphere using a controller.
So explain again how you tested the pressure.
When I went into the cockpit, I turned the pressurization switch to manual.
Tsolakis learns that during the early morning maintenance check on Helios 522, ground engineers had turned the P5 switch to manual. That allowed them to use the onboard generators to test the pressure seals on the plane's rear door without starting the engines. When the test was over, they didn't turn the switch back to automatic.
The procedure of pressurizing the aircraft has to do with setting the pressurization system from auto to manual. They were supposed to return the selector to the auto position.
Several hours later, when the flight crew entered the cockpit, the pressurization switch was still set to manual.
Lead air switches. It's bright today. Are you almost through? Pardon?
But neither the pilot nor co-pilot saw it. As a result, after takeoff, the cabin would not pressurize automatically. And the higher Flight 522 climbed, the thinner the atmosphere became. Not turning the switch back to automatic was a deadly hidden danger.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
Tsolakis believes this panel could be the key to the disaster.